Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Blackness Podcast. Welcome to the Blackness Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. All right, so this is the series, the second episode of the series of Whose Streets. Also a continuation, as we talked about last episode, of the myth of that the state is the government, but again, we're focusing on cities with our guest Rasul Mowatt and also my co-author for Laundering Black Rage, the book that I recently published with him back in April. So again, you can get that book, that will be in the show notes. So we're going to just continue our conversation with that, dealing with the spatial construction of cities, in relationship to how race is constructed by space, thinking about how to organize around some of these things, organize against some of the ways the cities may socialize us, things of that nature. So this is the second half of that conversation, and then we'll be back with two episodes, finally the X-Men episodes of the yet to record. A few things before we get to this episode. Like I said at the end of the last episode, we're doing a fundraiser for the Legal Defense Fund for the Middleton 2. That's John and Christopher Trotter. So the links to that will be in the show notes. Trying to raise as much money as we can. Money is about $20,000 right now. So if you need to donate, you can have to that. There'll be more information coming out. Like all the please get that. The patrons will be shouted out on that episode. But for this one, we'll have the patrons. So I thank you all who have been signing up. Other than that, again, check out the book. Definitely support the book too. And by the episode, There's a quote first. You said, without the spatial features and functions of a city, class, gender, race, and state power would fail to exist as we know it. And you've argued in Geographies of Threat about this idea of race being spatially constructed.
Yeah.
So with this quote, are you saying that the city socially constructs race, gender, and class? And how should we think about how cities help construct these categories? So we've already kind of hinted at this, or maybe done more than hint at it, but we've talked about how the city shapes our kind of ideation of the world. But are you arguing specifically like that the cities have a way of constructing class, gender, race? I'm more interested in race because I think that's the one where people think about, social construction the most, but all of them, honestly.
Yeah. And also it's hard to create segregated spaces around gender, right? You're not going to have, a woman's quarter or a men's quarter.
That's why always my argument. When people make the one-to-one comparison, that's always my argument. Like, we don't grow up segregated by gender.
Right. And I'm not trying to reinforce a gender binary, but it wouldn't even matter if it was gender non-conforming. Like space, you can't have segregated spaces based upon any type of range of gender specificity, right? Even if there is a majority of a certain gender in a certain location because of the income and so forth. When we think about low wage work, gender, that's very much gendered, and so then the neighborhood is very much gendered in a certain way because
single mom.
But it's not it's not completely right. It's not
right.
So yes, I am saying radically that it's not that race is socially constructed; it is spatially produced. But it's because of our understanding of social construction of race that got me to think about space being actual the basis of how race is produced. Well, first of all, social construction, we owe that to Du Bois. And, remember, Du Bois is not saying, for our listeners, that people choose race. That's not what he means by social construction. He is saying that, government, amongst other entities, creates the sort of social arrangements by not just coming up with the sort of categories, but the type of occupations that people will be held to greater degrees and so forth, and then the conditions in which those occupations can sort of take care of. So the type of housing, the type of healthcare, the type of education, and so forth is directly related to the occupations that people may be restricted to. And so the problems that come about because of that regulation is then what creates race. People can say, Black people were, criminals, in 1880s, 1890s, early turn of the 20th century, because they created the environment in which, legal forms of employment and legal forms of business weren't enough to provide basic living. People had to supplement one's, environment to not just take care of basic living, but to move up. Again, we're always trying to shore up, right? And
Right.
not just pay the bills. Like if we had the option just to have enough money to pay all our bills on time or have the money to pay off future bills, we would choose pay off future bills, right? Like if we would rather have like no money in our pocket but pay off all of our bills for the next 5 years. Many of us would probably choose that option of no bills, right?
Easily, yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's one part of thinking about an answer to that particular question of social construction. But then why I say it's spatially produced is that, but that social construction doesn't work without the neighborhood area, because it's not that just Black people walk around everywhere and it's just like how they conduct themselves everywhere that helps to create the myth of criminality. It's that you have a concentration of Black people in a certain area, in which you can turn off the water, you can not have business loans and other, forms of legal employment available.
You don't pave the roads.
You don't pave the roads.
Yeah.
You send more police there.
Yeah.
You close the hospitals, all these types of things. And then what do you have? You have people with front lawns with overgrown grass. You have people out at midnight on a street corner, for whatever reason,
Yeah.
no air conditioning, not because they selling anything. It's too hot to be in the house,
Yeah.
right? Or you create the mechanisms for illegal business. And so then you run the story, the news story about the number of arrests that happen in a certain area and the type of arrests, and baby being left in a microwave and all these other types of horrible things. So it's the space that then actually just, gives the concrete sort of justification for that, right? And so then what ends up happening is that then people take with them the description of that neighborhood, whether because they stay in that neighborhood area, or they're from that neighborhood area, or they look like people from that neighborhood area. And that's the only way that the narrative, the myth of those narratives stay relevant, because those neighborhoods remain the same. The South Bronx is still the South Bronx, even if it's becoming a little bit gentrified, it's still the South Bronx, right? Like, and the same thing with so many other particular places, the South Side of Chicago, still the South Side of Chicago,
And there's a certain almost dog whistle, or a certain, like, you just name an area,
Yeah.
Like, you know, we know what you're getting at, even if you don't say the race of the people. Like you said, South Side Chicago. So much to the point that even if an area, like you said, is gentrified or whatever, our memory of it for such a time has been, that's where the hood is, that's the black people. That's how we think about it, right? Like, or if you say, you know, coming back to the Kendrick, if you say Compton, you know, we know what you're talking about, you know, like
Right.
you just so.
But then also Compton is then usurped by Los Angeles, because remember, most of these people are talking about Compton, but then it becomes LA, you know, because I mean, like even though people still rep Compton, technically, then people rep the larger city, exactly, right? You know, and so, you know, it conjures that up, right? And that's all, you know, that's all an example of how space helps to actually be the thing that keeps race in our consciousness. Because otherwise, if there's no neighborhood restriction, if there's no living arrangement restriction, it's hard to maintain those myths, because you're not deploying the police everywhere in your city, you know. But having a neighborhood concentrated, you can deploy police only into that area, and that's all people see is a bunch of sirens going into that neighborhood area, you know, and that justifies it. So you disperse it out, or
It's also on a very basic level, like if you put all black people in a neighborhood, then they're gonna keep reproducing black people.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like on a real simple level, like if everybody that looks this way has to live in the neighborhood, then they're gonna consistently produce that people. So I'm saying it's literally constructed materially. It's like we're not allowed to live somewhere else, or we're discouraged from living somewhere else, or even if we feel like we need to live there, that's where we feel safest. Whatever the reason, we'll just keep producing. And this is not an argument that everybody of some rainbow coalition, fake rainbow coalition, or everybody coming together and making a bunch of mixed babies. I'm not even trying to get into that. I'm just saying, like, literally the neighborhood reproduces itself by the people reproducing themselves.
Right. I mean, and I
Yeah.
mean, I know people want to talk about, you know, oftentimes we don't recognize that slavery is only like one generation, two generations away, but things like racial restrictive covenants is even less, because, you know, racial restrictive covenants is struck down by the Supreme Court decades before the last cases of racial restrictive covenants are wiped out. Remember, it's in the 70s where they're completely wiped out, even though it was
struck
legal
down
by the Supreme Court, shut down. Yeah, in the 30s, right? Yeah, 30s or 40s, right? And so that the racial restriction of these neighborhoods haven't been sort of dispersed. Like some of these neighborhoods are still majority, even if you either have gentrification that's happening, or you just have had other populations that are also poor, that aren't black, going to live in those neighborhood areas. Those areas are still that. I mean, Little Haiti doesn't have all Haitians living in it in Miami, even though it's called Little Haiti.
Right.
But it's still called Little Haiti, right? And so racial restrictive covenants is not that old, and still plays an important aspect in our social consciousness, but also how we function and how we operate. We avoid these neighborhood areas.
And like you said, we think that, like you said, when police are sent there, those neighborhoods in a mythical way become the reasons why we think police budgets should be that high. Because we don't want it to spread, right? That's how people think. Like, we don't want it to spread. Or even some of the people who live in those neighborhoods, because I'm not saying stuff doesn't really happen to folks. They want safety themselves, right? Like I don't think that they're going to get it through more police, but that's what they've been told. So yeah, we need, like, I have an aunt in Chicago on the South Side, and she lives in this little strip that's that You know, I haven't been there in a minute, but when she used to live there, it was a nice little strip in the middle of the hood. But I don't know how they did it, but they got a police officer to sit at the corner of that neighborhood all night. So I could walk around in that little area all night. The police just literally sat there. So nobody messed with them. I don't know how they did it. I never asked. But I'm saying, like, we these neighborhoods become like, this is where the laundering for me really like starts to take shape, because all the stuff that we think we want, the safety and stuff, like these neighborhoods become a way to launder that stuff through for the city to then justify more repression, to justify less investment, to, you know, get a grant here or there, like all these narratives, like from that construction of race and other things too, but particularly race, it creates this boogeyman, you know, because like we talk about too, Black rage isn't just the response to oppression, like we talk about, it's also from the standpoint of the state and capital, it's also like a moral panic, right? It's also this boogeyman that might spread elsewhere. Like it's also that too, you know. So it becomes a way to gas all that up. And like you said, it's constructed by keeping people in their neighborhoods, keeping people in these sides of town that you can all play off each other, you know.
Right. Certain cities, they talk about animation of public space. So animation of public space for the listeners is anything from having a table for people to play chess on in a park, or having movies in the park, putting public art in the park. These are ways to animate a public space, because now people are going to come to that space that either hasn't been used or has been used, but in quote unquote undesirable ways, right? The park has been a hot spot for drug activity.
Right.
Or
Hot
there's
spot.
been right, or there's been some other form of violence that's happened. And I'm not trying to diminish like what's happened. Some people have been shot in that park. Some people may have been sexually assaulted in the park. I'm not trying to diminish that, but people have created the narrative as if animation of public space is the solution to those incidents, not something else. Not, well, if people are overdosing in the park, that tells you that the issue is drugs and drug addiction, not, we need a festival, right? So why not why not deal with the addiction levels in your city, as opposed to let's just move the addicted people out of the park who cause trouble. So animation of public space. So people think, let's take over the park because it's been wrongly animated by these other population of people. And let's do something else there. Because if we take over the park and we clean it up and pick up the needles out of the grass and so forth, and we have a regular presence there, that other population is not going to be welcome there. And so, in certain cases, there are some people who do think insidiously. And so they're thinking about, beating the homeless people out of the park and so forth. But there's some people who are just, they do think like, and for very good reason. Like, I want children to play in this park. I want to bring my kids to this park. It's nice to have a place that's clean, right?
Yeah, who doesn't want that? Like,
right? Like, I mean, like, but the laundering is ignoring the costs. The costs are, these are resources and services that could go to the deeper issue, and the deeper issue is not having a ugly park. The deeper issues are the fact that you have people who are having to depend on an illegal sort of, business, arena.
Sometimes those people will advocate, though the same people we're talking about, they'll advocate for jobs or for investment on top of, we go out and clean up the park or whatever, or we need more things for kids to do. But the state will always say, when they have a choice between truly empowering people to live quality lives or giving them something to be pacified by, they will always pay and invest in the pacification, right? Like they will always do that. So if it's between a festival and jobs, you're gonna get your festival. More than likely, you're gonna get your jobs. Like it's just, like
Right,
that's just
right.
that's
Or,
just
or,
the
or,
yeah,
or, or, or even if it's the jobs are not going to be paid in enough
yeah,
of a
yeah,
way in which
yeah.
people can move, work their way out of that job. Like, there are
Right.
a lot, I mean, like there used to be a time when there used that street cleaning was typically just that machine. It was just the sort of automated, not automated, but the big truck that people would come through and it's just the edges. But so a lot of cities are to, have an employment structure for everyday people. Some cities have gone to the street sweeper. So literally a person, has a broom and, an industrial dustpan, and they're sweeping up cigarette butts and so forth in an entire downtown area. I mean, we're talking about, they're walking around these
And
places.
this is not community service.
This is not community
Yeah,
service.
because that's
Um,
all that should be.
and this is
Yeah.
also not like landscaping, division, and so forth. This is a part of some people's push. They've created then these jobs, but it's not like people who are being hired in those jobs are getting paid 20, 30, $40 an hour with, you know, intentionally for the ability to work themselves out of that job or to work up in those jobs. Those jobs are just, just enough that where it's like people are going to take it because it's better than not having anything, but it's not going to maybe change your social arrangements and social space,
Yeah, it still reproduces generally the same thing, but
Yeah,
it's a new
yeah,
job or something, but it's the same type of job that puts you in the neighborhood you're already in, you
yeah.
know.
So
Like,
street sweepers,
yeah.
um, park ambassadors, park concierge staff, they call them different things in different cities and they do different things. Some people are just cleaning, some people are physically present in the park and they're not police, but they're there to handle heat strokes and they're there to do crisis management, like talking somebody down, and while also there to program the space. But they're not being paid, they're not being compensated to the level in which they reflect supposedly the value of the animation of the public space, right? And yeah, so these are just these ways in which this happens, the laundering happens, because in a nutshell, we're not still dealing with the core issues. The core issues is that there are growing disparities in the ability to live in a city, although cities are still pushing people out and they're still attracting cities in. This push-pull is constantly happening, in different cities where, certain cities need a labor force, so they're trying to attract more people to come and work at varying levels of labor. And some cities want to push undesirable populations, whether they're immigrant populations, migrant populations, non-white populations, whatever they may be, away to the other city.
Mm. So there's kind of even a laundering across cities, right? Not
Right.
not just within the city, but even across cities too, right?
Right, right. We think the migrant issue is just about country to country. No, it's about city. Like, because people aren't going to a country and like, we're gonna set up a tent in the middle of a forest. Like, we're gonna live on the land in this other country. Like, no, they're leaving one city, whether it's in another country or in another state, to go to another city
Mm.
because that other city has a better opportunity, right? Certain type of privileged occupations, we just call that, you know, um, you know, uh, better job offers, better job opportunities. But for another class of people, this is migrancy, because certain cities have become so unable to find a living wage, much less more than a living wage, so then you got to go to another city in which you can do the similar type of skilled work for a better living wage. or to be able to enjoy the same living wage because the costs are lower in that other city.
It makes me think of a quote you had. You said, the city is a bedazzled labor camp, complete with amphitheaters, dog parks, and $2 Tuesdays on all IPAs, as cities are, quote unquote, the machine of the state. Growth and abandonment are effective tools for city management. So, like you just described it, like it's, so I don't necessarily even have a question to that one, but like just the growth and abandonment kind of work dialectically with each other. Like you say, you're moving people across. So we tend to think about, like you said, nation states and borders.
Right.
But you're saying, like, I'm coming from Mexico City to go to LA is actually probably more true of the, I mean, of course, the borders matter. I'm not saying they don't, as far as how people are thinking about it, because laws change across borders and stuff.
Right.
But on the day-to-day, people are thinking about how they can go from Mexico City to to LA or to somewhere in Texas or something like that. They're looking at, like you said, like it becomes like this bedazzled labor camp.
Exactly. Yeah. So like, so Miami wants to continue to grow because they don't want Tampa and Orlando. I mean, I know there are other cities in Florida, but those are the other two large scale cities.
Mhm.
Right? They don't want those two cities to outgrow it because those two cities are going to attract people that they want to come to Miami. So Miami wants to do two things. They want to attract people better than Tampa and Orlando, and they also want to push out more people better than Tampa and Orlando. Same thing applies to Houston in relation to Dallas or, San Antonio and, places, states like Chicago. Chicago has strangled the rest of Illinois. So there's not another city that, in the state of Illinois that can compete with Illinois, right? And certain other cities, certain other states have a similar dynamic. Like, Minneapolis, it had strangled the rest of the state.
Yeah, you're right. There's not really a competition among cities, even in certain states. I never really thought about that.
Right.
Indianapolis has tried to do that. It's not, I don't know how successful it's been, but it's close. Because I mean,
Yeah. Right. Right. And
versus a
so
place like Ohio, where
yeah.
like a place like Ohio, there's a lot of competition among cities. You have Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, so not one gets to come out on top. But yeah, that's true. But yeah, the bedazzled labor camps thing, I think, just kind of, because it does have all these amenities, and that's part of why people aren't just migrating due to just getting a job. It's like, well, we could be by all this other stuff too, right? Like that's part of the enticement of it all.
Right. If Friday night in July we can go downtown Cincinnati and watch a movie on the side of the wall of a major sort of shopping area, or we can we can go to a street festival in Times Square, as opposed to some other parts of New York, or we can have, a parade, based upon certain cultural traditions in, Miami. Then exactly, like, that pushes that city ahead of another particular city in attracting, certain things. And at the same time, being tough on crime helps to push, a certain population out of the city and forcing that population to go to some other particular city.
Yeah, and so is that true? Would you say that similarly works, like with even outside of the United States borders? Would you say this is our approach, like in the UK or even in the global South? Like, would you say that that's the dual? Because I know I don't want to Americanize everything. So would you say that it works similarly outside of the United States, even if even if there may not be as many amenities to play with, like the excessiveness is not as much maybe in other places as it is in the United States?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was one of the arguments I tried to make in Geography's a Thread, is that once we start thinking about cities, it helps us to see that there is no difference. Like, all cities function and operate in the same way because it's it's for the same purpose, extraction, and that extraction leads to dispossession. And so capital is working in the same way through each one of these cities. And so then you have then cities learning from each other about what to do with policing, or what to do with tech, or what to do with arts, and what to do with streets and sanitation, and what to do with airports, and what to do with school systems. They're constantly sort of learning from each other, and what to do with water supply and water management. Every single place. So Johannesburg is always up against the development of Cape Town and Durban. Um, you know, maybe certain places, because they have maybe older traditions tied to their cities. Like, the cities are themselves old and pre-capitalism, even though they're still in existence under capitalism. If you think about Japan, where, yes, Tokyo is a center of Japan, both in the present day, but also in the past, but Kyoto is still a highly relevant city. Even if the population is dramatically smaller in Kyoto, it is still like the actual cultural capital of Japan, in the terms of the traditions. But that's because it's just an older, it's just an older country and older cities that.
Yeah, China has some of that too. Yeah.
Exactly. But places in the UK, London operates much like cities in, let's say, the state of New York, or Philadelphia, right? You know, Philadelphia is a more dominant city than Pittsburgh. And so London is the center of England, right? So, not the United Kingdom, but let's just say England, so, but Manchester, is right behind it. And so there's these tensions between Manchester and London, right? And there's these tensions between even Leeds and London, because this is why then certain laws of city autonomy, become, at play, where there's a greater sort of dependency between cities, maybe in the United States, whereas in places like United Kingdom, cities up until like maybe the 1980s, 1990s had greater authority in terms of autonomous control, meaning that certain cities could be so progressive in the United Kingdom, specifically in England, where they could be like, we're going to exclusively just build affordable housing for the next 3 years, no privatized housing, or we're going to give everybody a standard, basic income, right? We're going to give all residents of our city $1,000, or we're going to institute, like in Barcelona, we're going to institute rent control. So there's, like, rent is never going to exceed this amount, right? But in England specifically, there was a period of time where cities, could either tax or undertax differently than the rest of, and so they were able to do certain creative ventures to create a better public school system than another city. But the Tories, once they came into power, um, once the Tories not came into power, because they were already in power because of Margaret Thatcher, but when the Tories began to change the laws at the national level for the United Kingdom, they were able to ensure in England specifically that cities lost a lot of their authority. And part of this was in response to the progressive nature of how Manchester and Birmingham had kind of went in a more progressive leftist route with affordable housing and all these types of things. And they were trying to crush that sort of leftist. When I say leftist, I'm not talking about liberal, leftist sort of ways
Right.
of and so they were successful with changing the national legislation, and that resulted in less taxes that the city could
Reserve.
reserve and convert for their own use to improve streets and schools, and now they had to send it to the national government. And so then you had this shift where then all of a sudden people turned on labor in the United Kingdom. So cities are, man, like cities are vital, to how a state can maintain itself. Cities are vital for how national governments can remain legitimate. And cities are also vital expressions for moving in, alternative directions for people who are trying to create new systems of living that aren't oppressive. But yeah.
So
There's actually a pretty good, I mean, I know we've done all types of weird shout outs this entire episode with everything from Bridgerton, Taylor Swift concerts, Craig, Kendrick Lamar, and
the
the other
artists,
the artists, yeah.
the other artists.
But there's this really good, I hate to even call him YouTuber, named Tom Nichols, young white guy from the United Kingdom who does a lot of YouTube pieces on philosophy, thinkers, and so forth. But he started to, because he's, been at it for so long, try to branch out to other things. And he does this great road trip around different cities in the United Kingdom, discussing and thinking and showing how, the differences between the cities, but how that even came about. How London has sucked all the taxes from Leeds and Liverpool that could have really expanded those cities for itself. And how then the Tories were then able to create a narrative that gave the illusion as if Labour betrayed everyday people, when in fact all the Tories did was just actually change the national laws that prevented local government from actually being able to do local government.
Yes, yeah, that's a. I'm glad I asked that question because, like you said, because like you say on one side the city hides the state, but then when the cities try to become autonomous, then the state kind of comes out, right?
Yeah. Like, hold up, yeah.
Yeah, like
because
don't go too far. Yeah,
right, because that could hurt their role with extraction, because now all of a sudden the city is self-extracting. Like we're asking everybody to contribute their fair share, right? Radical, right? Stay in the city, contribute to your fair share. We all contribute to our public transportation system. We all contribute to our public education system. We all contribute, so if cities were autonomous, they could do that. And who wouldn't want to move then to that city? So all of a sudden, you can have a tax base leave London and go to Manchester if that's how Manchester is going to choose to operate. Because, like, I want to live in a place where rent is controlled, and I want to have a place where affordable housing is provided, and so forth. They couldn't have that happen, right? So shut that down, prevent, the autonomy of cities. Now, I don't know. I mean, some people who's listening, they may think that that's similar to this whole red and blue state and red and blue city sort of argument in the United States. It's not the same.
not even close. Yes.
Right, because that's all symbolic and so forth, because it's just, the same cult of personality that's now applied to a mayor that we applied to governors and senators and presidents, right, where we associated certain people being representatives or whatever else, but everyday sort of conditions aren't really, effectively changed. So like when people were talking about sanctuary cities, fundamentally on the ground, that didn't mean much, right? At all, right? New York attracted all of these migrants with the promise of work opportunities, and then gave them no work. Right. And so, yeah, sanctuary city, but be in a holding pattern as part of our surplus population. So either you're gonna, everybody in your whole family, including your grandma, is now doing Uber driving just so that you can afford, some makeshift housing situation, or you're going to engage in illegal activity that then creates the narrative to push you out, even though you were attracted to the city. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you don't go to a city just because, like, I want to take a gamble. I don't know what's going to happen. Like, no, you're going to go to a city because they attracted you with the promise of sanctuary, employment opportunity, housing, and so forth. So that whole that was a narrative piece. So it's not the same thing what we're talking about. We're talking about a period in time in which in certain countries in certain countries they still have that. In certain countries there's tensions that they're on the verge of losing it, and some countries have just recently lost it. So United Kingdom with the 90s, they recently lost it. So the implications of it are still being seen in the present.
Berlin is another one because they still carry a lot of the before that everything united. They still have, you can still see a lot of the left, like communist ways of living.
And that's why a lot of the research and literature on gentrification in Spain or in Germany is way better than the literature and research on gentrification in the United States. Like, they're more on top of what's happening. They don't think of gentrification as just a mysterious phenomenon. They know it's planned. And so they've been studying like bus route changes and employment changes and, and also how certain things are a part of the laundering. So we create this linear, the city created this linear park, and they know the linear park was just a buffer and barrier between an undesirable area and a desirable area. They also know that, it's a part of then the desirable area to then expand from a protected wall space into the undesirable area with new increased sort of property taxes for things that are associated with that, things that people are just now becoming aware of, but they're still not researching it, right? Especially with the High Line in Atlanta and the 606 in Chicago, and the High Line is New York, and then the Belt Line is Atlanta.
Right. Yeah. So I guess there's so much more to say, but I guess it's a last question. Can what utilities do cities have for any kind of liberation or even progressive struggle? Because I guess like every episode people are like, okay, y'all just put the shit in the ground, under the ground more than 6 feet. So what utility could do a cities have? I mean, I think the answer you just gave about somewhat in the UK gives a little glimmer of hope as far as how people maybe could think about it. But what utility can a city have? Because I don't think you're saying, and I know I'm not saying that we should all go back to huts and tents, right? Like I think sometimes that's the tendency.
The grid living, right?
Yeah, like we should all go, this very I'm not gonna touch because I'll get in trouble again if I go down that road. But I'm saying like people want us to, I don't think we're not saying that we should go to some pre-industrialized life, basically. I don't think we're either one of us say that. There's clearly advantages in the upgrades in technology and even the quality of life, even under capitalism. Like that's a fact. Not for everybody equally at all. That's the reason why capitalism made the move. But I'm just saying, like, clearly it's better to have running water than and sewage pipes and stuff like that than not. So we're not saying just go live in the woods. But so what utility can a city have? Obviously there's other things that have to occur, but what utility could a city have at all?
Right. So just to dispel, just in case there are still people who still hold on to some of the off the grid living solution, right? Who are listening to Black myths. And, I mean, we sometimes think of that supposedly as a so-called, white idea, but no, like it's not. Like there's a lot of people who aren't, because they think that. They think you live, removing oneself from the city, either going to a small village or
As
or
sovereign
or, or
movement.
getting getting a cabin and so forth. Like that, that's possibly personally solution for your generation, but you cannot you can't sustain that for your multi generations of your family,
And that
and
can't be scaled up for most people.
it
So
cannot be scaled up. And unless your off the grid still is dependent upon interaction with the other spaces, you're going to still go into town once a month to do things, to pick up certain supplies because you don't make toilet paper, don't, what I'm saying? You can't hunt enough to have a balanced diet, all throughout the year. So off the grid is a individual solution, just like personally recycling very well for climate change.
or financial literacy or something.
Yeah, exactly. So one, if we recognize that our oppression is collective, then our solution also has to be collective. And it's not about some symbolic socially collective. No, it's collective because we're literally in the same space, right? Oftentimes, right? Either we're in similar city structures or we're in the same city, because cities hold the vast majority of the population. And around the world, um, over 60% of people live in cities. Um, that's always going to be the case, and it's going to increase because the ability to live outside of the city is becoming worse and worse and worse and worse, whether it's because of environmental conditions like erosion and flooding and so forth, because of the issues of climate change, or it's because the lack of capital infrastructure. The mines have closed, the factories have closed, and there's not another major employer in the sort of city, right? A city is not dependent upon a prison, right? But a town is. And so if a prison leaves a city, you still have a lot of other employment, opportunities and so forth.
Right.
So cities present the best response to best collective response to a condition.
Because it's somewhat because it's diversified.
Yeah, and then
Not totally that, just because diversification doesn't automatically save anything. I'm just saying, but it does, like you said, in comparison to a prison, like you're not relying on, Pendleton Correctional Facility to pay everybody.
right, that's right. And so, but a city also helps to force ourselves to think more spatially about how to execute a solution, right? So it's one thing to think your small food pantry with 3 or 4 shelves, and you supposedly give out, 100 100 some, a couple few hundred meals, bags of food per year. And it's a whole nother thing to think spatially about your food pantry. Can you deal with food insecurity in this neighborhood? Like chopping up a city and no longer thinking of the city, such as Indianapolis, as being 800,000 to 1.3 million people, but thinking of St. Dime, 10th Street area, at the most in that sort of area, 10,000 people, 15,000 people live in that area. I mean, I could be wrong. And so, but I'm just saying, but it's not going to be
Right.
100,000. Yeah,
No.
it's not 50,000 people.
It's
That's
just the Near East Side that you're talking about.
exactly.
Yeah.
So we could concentrate an effort to address an issue in that neighborhood. So just like the people in the United Kingdom and Manchester and, you know, pre-1990s was able to address affordable housing, you know, unlike the rest of the cities in the United States, and they created a mechanism to actually begin to think about, you know, collective responsibility for housing. So people, you know, homelessness almost evaporated, you know, and all this type of stuff because of that effort. We could apply a solution to just a neighborhood area around something, food insecurity, um, public education, um, teen employment, maybe not everybody employment, but teen employment. Like, so if we could think about, we could do that. And then we move to another issue, you know, so we solve that issue and now we're trying to maintain that solution. Now we can move to what's the next issue based upon that. But since we don't think spatially, we run our food pantry for the entire city of Indianapolis, but we only got 6 shelves of food, and we only can give out 400, 500 bags of food per year. So we don't ever make a dent on any one area of the city because our scale, our scale of our capability of solving a thing, we haven't grown our scale to the level of the issue that we're able to tackle. We're thinking of the big issue, and we're operating off of a very small level. I mean, it's the same thing with daycare. We can provide, you know, in a neighborhood area, all the daycare that's needed for all the children that's in that area. Not one child can not have daycare. You can solve it completely, right? But since we don't think of it, we have whole neighborhood areas where there is no daycare, there is no nursery, you know, areas. So families got to drive to, a distance just to drop off a child before they go to some type of space to work, you know. And so that's what I think a city offers us. If we think of solutions, it concentrates our thinking. Instead of thinking about the United States as the place in which we live in Chicago, but we
on the South Side in this
in South Shore.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. Yeah.
You know, and so maybe what I could do is I could do something about South Shore, you know, and if I can't even start out with South Shore, maybe I could do something with just our block. With just our block, can we get rid of the rodent problem? With just our block, can we, do our own sort of food pantry, food insecurity, right? And it's possible. I mean, we have some of this that happens like with certain, you have certain campuses where some students have created a food pantry system for students who have food insecurity. Now it's not too far off of what we're talking about, but they're not trying to provide a food pantry for this city. They're trying to provide a food pantry for 20,000, 30,000 students, but technically all 20,000, 30,000 students don't need it. It's just a certain number, 2,000, 5,000 students out of 30,000 needs that food pantry. So you're able to maybe potentially address some level of the food scarcity on that campus. And so it's the same sort of,
idea. Are you talking about some kind of mutual aid, which has become people I think sometimes over rely on that sometimes? Or are you talking about something a little bit more than mutual aid?
Yeah. I'm talking about, I don't know what I'm talking about because in some sense, people have taken away what mutual aid is, right? And they've made it something else. Some cases they've reduced what mutual aid was into something else, right? Like we're handing out toothpaste and socks and underwear. I'm not saying that's not a need, but that's not technically mutual aid. Like mutual aid is the sickle cell anemia tests that the Young Lords and the Panther Party were running, right? They weren't receiving compensation for it. It was delivery of a direct need and service around a larger issue of health care. Providing socks and toothpaste is an important sort of delivery of items, but the issue isn't, warm feet and gingivitis.
So you're saying simply just giving people
Items, food
items and goods
it's not mutual aid, right? Mutual aid is mutual aid. The aid is, your basic needs are not being met, and so you are providing some type of collective shared response to, like, when you don't have shelter, we have come up with a mechanism to provide you with shelter. That's what classically was mutual aid, but what we've done is since we haven't been able to scale our work up, we've reduced mutual aid down to just being the provision of care packages, right? And again, I'm not trying to disrespect nobody.
Right. I'm just saying it's a term that comes up in a lot of spaces, and I do think there's a good intention there, but I think the scale is always my issue with these things. So I think what you were saying earlier, as far as your neighborhood, but people don't. That's something we don't really think spatially, and some of that is the state. Like when we talk about, like even when we talk about Indianapolis, that's been referenced a lot in this episode. Indianapolis has done it's just done a job of really dispersing people more and more out of like traditional neighborhoods. You just get like apartment complexes.
Yeah, right.
And
but in certain cases, then that may even be easier to scale, right? Because now you can now deal with that.
No, that's a good point.
Complex,
yeah,
right. Like, so you don't even have to worry about a block. Like, can we just deal with now our apartment complexes? Now we don't even have to deal with our neighborhood area, which might have had 5,000 to 10,000 people. Now we're only dealing with the apartment complex, so we're only talking about maybe 1,000 people at best,
right?
And so we could come up with our own collective, dry cleaning, daycare, after school supervision, summer day camp type of mechanisms. But yeah, mutual aid, if we think spatially, like for example, food insecurity is spatial. Like, and then everybody in the city everywhere is not struggling with food. It's concentrated in certain places because a certain population of people who are needing the food are also concentrated in certain populations. And so they travel to the location, to the food pantry. And what we know is, yes, we know in the long run, food pantries is not a proper solution to food insecurity. It's an emergency structure. But the fact that food pantries now see people going to the pantries like a grocery store every week means that the creation or the need for food is no longer, we don't have emergency systems anymore. The emergency systems are regular, ongoing, structures of need, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so thinking spatially does, help, in so many different ways. If we think, about stuff, socially, I know you're, doing work with the Pendleton, aspect. And so part of trying to build support around the Pendleton too, you got to chop up the state of Indiana to find support, but you don't chop up the state and just deal with this massive thing called county. You go to a city, and certain cities you just completely ignore, because it's just.
And then when you go to a city, you have to identify neighborhoods, You have to identify influential like groups within a city, and that you got to map that out, and that's a lot of work, honestly.
Right, right.
So yeah, it's not a it's not an easy solution, but I think I appreciate this episode because again, I don't think we think about, like, I remember when I was writing the essays and I would listen to the interviews you did with Douglas Storm, the four-parter, and obviously I'd already read the book, but I was trying to just tighten the screws up, and I think there was a tendency of I didn't want laundering to be abstract. So I was like, what can we tie this to that's a bit more like concrete so people can really see it? And that's when I added, like, I just went through the whole thing. It was already in there a little bit, but I really just populated it with this question of cities. Because like at the forefront of it all, to even begin the conquest, you had to build settlements like you talk about that eventually become cities. So you can move the stuff you're stealing back to the mother country. So you need a home base for that, right? Like that was the kind of it be like inception of it all. So but that also creates opportunities because we are concentrating these very, like, I guess you're saying in a way, like very cooperative places. Even if we're just living there, even if we're not working together at a job, like, we already kind of do some of these things on a very small scale. Like we'll borrow stuff from somebody, we'll get a ride, kids will play together, something. Uh, so it's not too far fetched, but I think the idea of returning back to neighborhoods and thinking about it, especially, I think that's just important because again, I think you're talking about a lot of like you're talking about like dealing with material needs on a very basic level, but I think in all types of organizing, the question of scale and the question of how to actually take a population and address stuff, I don't, within an area. I know some organizations that do that. I know one in New Orleans that definitely tries to do this, but it doesn't typically happen that way. And that is a question of like, how do you build that out,
Yeah, no, there's a group, I can't remember the name right now, but it's a group out of Chicago, Mothers Against Gun Violence. I forgot the acronym, but they thought spatially, like they would physically take over a corner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, of course, tragically one died, and in some other cases, a couple others got, shot, injured. But that was thinking spatially, like, because they were thinking if we physically take over the corner that, some of these people are hanging out at, that results in either a rival gang driving by and shooting or them shooting into cars or whatever else, that limits the spaces in which the shootings are happening, right? Because the shootings don't happen all over the place, right? Uh, and they were successful. I mean, it was in Inglewood. I mean, they didn't completely get rid of gun violence, but their presence and their, and in many cases, them putting their bodies on the line resulted in, one of the more direct responses that was not about incarcerating more young people, and that was really true to caring about their community and these people who were in the illegal business. I think I've said in other particular spaces, one of the things when I was doing Geographies of Threat that I was so shocked to find was all this narrative around Inglewood, of Chicago, the area that's really the area that's called Chirac. Chicago is not Chirac, it's Inglewood. That's what it's, called, right? Is because it's ironic that in this entire area, I'm not calling for more surveillance, but there was only 5 cameras in all of Inglewood. 5 cameras, and 4 of them were regular street light cameras. So they weren't even associated. Now, of course, after I did that book, there was a contract with the city to have the top shotter uh, company, which is that company that has the microphones that are active, that come on when something that sounds like a gunshot, it comes on and records the activity, and also sends a notice to the police. And so there was a contract with the police. So this is after that. So this was before that this was instituted. But then you have like one block in downtown Chicago off of Michigan Avenue, and that one block had 13, 14 cameras, one block. Because it was protecting what? Capital. It was protecting ATMs and banks and Marshall Fields or some other type of department store, and all that type of stuff. One block, 13 surveillance cameras, all of Inglewood, 5. So all the narrative around Inglewood would tell you that 13 cameras should have been in Inglewood if they wanted to somehow deal with crime, not to be tough on it, but somehow, get to solve these things.
Right.
But then this is why then what these mothers were doing was so remarkable, because they knew that the city wasn't real. The city wasn't true to addressing the issue. What was going to happen was either it was going to be another set of guns coming in and shooting people, and it was going to be arrests and so forth. And they figured, like, we can take matters into our own hands. So yeah. So, I appreciate the question, because, I'm not used to thinking about solutions at all. My thing is dealing with, the issues, but but no, but part of the motivation of the work of Geography is a Threat, but then also the work I did with you with Laundering Black Rage is to sort of provide activists and organizers with some type of theoretical viewpoint of the issues that they're tackling. And what we were both trying to do in the book is to get people to think spatially, not just about what's happening, but where it's happening and why is it happening in the places where it's happening.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why we start with cities and art, and I think sometimes something I'm still working on and doing interviews is a lot of times, people recognize that, but it goes to the abstract, because we're not taught to think spatially. So I have to make sure I kind of work on that even in the talks and interviews, because I think people jump to, what about this dude that did this and they're in this place, and what about this dude that made money off of dead Black people over here, and it's just like, yeah,
right.
Yeah, that's part of it, but it's also like something you said earlier where our minds aren't necessarily geared to the solution, even when we mean well. So even with stuff that's not high profile, or it would see no one would ever see it as a controversy. Like if somebody gets killed in the neighborhood and we hold a festival, like, and it's like that's nobody would see that as like backwards on the surface, but it doesn't really deal with the fact that people getting killed or that there's folks overdosing here. It's just like, we're gonna celebrate, and we're gonna try to show some resiliency, and hopefully that can withstand. And then sometimes the festival gets shot up, right? And then we're like, oh, niggas can't get along. Well, this honestly never addressed like why you had a festival. Like this doesn't address the issue. So we're already got a pre-programmed to do that on very mundane, everyday things that nobody would ever see as laundering. Even though I think you could say that is a version of it. Those are very mundane things that nobody sees, as just shrug it off, like, oh, we're having a community, blah blah, But so when the big story happens, it's not much different of an approach. If you really think about it, I hadn't actually made a connection until you were saying that earlier. But like, it's not that big. It's not, if you're gonna have a party, you know, in response to, or if you're going to march through the neighborhood to stop gun violence, if that's your logic, it's not really that further along to be like, okay, we're going to do a mural for this high profile police killing. It's actually very much in the same vein of logic. You know, like it's not that much different, right? So, but
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
yeah. So it's like, so it's, I mean, so let's say, I mean, as the poet that you are, I mean, we both can sort of think about either the ways in which you are either beloved or not really respected too much as a poet in Indianapolis, but we can just sort of, just say that if something was to tragically happen to you in relationship to police, that, would your parents appreciate either an annual poetry slam night in your name, or we're gonna do a legal campaign to look into investigating properly your demise?
right, right,
And so we can see how people would be enamored and supportive of the poetry slam because you're a poet, but it completely misses the point that you were unjustly killed by the police. And if we really hold you to be beloved, it's not having an annual event in your name and more people keep getting killed by the police who aren't poets, who won't have an event. It's at least finally, at least for one case, we're going to be so dogged in our sort of pursuit of justice that we end up, maybe getting your family some type of form of restitution. The police department is now federally investigated. I'm not sitting there saying that these are great solutions, but
right. But at least it is at least an attempt to address what happened. Yeah, like that at the core, it's that, right? Like
right.
a
That's right.
poetry slam, unless you're doing that to raise money for my family, or unless you're doing that as a way to bring awareness to actions that are already happening that do address the issue, then I think art is worth it. Then those things that will maybe galvanize people differently to then go work, I think are fine. But to do that as a standalone thing to do a poetry slam as a standalone thing in response to my death at the hands of police, you know, like it doesn't make sense. But I'm saying, like, so when a celebrity comes and does it, because this is my point basically, when the celebrities come and do it, or when the state does it in a very gross expression, like you get Juneteenth paper plates or something, right? It's not that much different. Like it's, like the logic isn't actually that much different. I would still say the corporation and all of that is worse because they don't even really have well intentions in the case in versus the regular people. But I'm saying the logic is not that far apart. It's a spectrum if you think about it, and the logic's not that far apart from each other because there's a certain there's a certain avoidance of actually struggling, that everyone's engaging in.
Right.
So,
But
yeah.
like some local efforts, because I mean I know but people who may be listening don't know, but a lot of my work started with researching lynching, and I've after all these years of researching lynching, being able to finally come across a group of community people in Indianapolis who have tried to come up with ways to memorialize, right? So that's art, right? Having a historical marker. But in this case, it's not laundering because nobody knew in one case where this lynching happened, which is
Right.
right downtown underneath the, in the present day Indianapolis Arts Garden archway. And so their effort to mark the location in which this brother was killed unjustly so long ago, 1850s, right? Uh, that's a reflection of, even to your point that some certain cases the art can do a thing. It doesn't. It doesn't. In this case, it does address the actual issue, because part of the issue is
We
this
didn't
was
know.
very exactly
Yeah, we didn't
right.
know.
And now the next step for certain people, it could be this group or it could be other people, is, well, does he have any descendants? Can we try to provide some form of restitution? All this type of stuff. Now, this is one of the few cases in which the assailants, who were white, were actually like arrested and convicted. It was rare even during that time period. Another case that this group, and the group is the Indiana Remembrance Coalition, so just to respect them and give them proper dues and a shout out. The other piece of work is that even though they're trying to work on an actual memorial that is more art directed for another lynching in the city of Indianapolis, the first effort they did was just to have an actual, just a regular basic burial marker, not a headstone, but just a burial marker with the name, because before the man was just buried and there was nothing to mark the grave except for a number, right? And then the other part was they changed the forensic information, where the coroner's note said suicide, and they changed they got it retroactively, changed the homicide to reflect actually what happened, right? So I'm just trying to give these examples not only to shout out these people's work, but also to show how, like, sometimes it's not as like long drawn out and complicated as a Pendleton 2 defense case, or like, it sometimes it is small scale. It takes maybe a lot of effort, and a long time to stick with it, but like sometimes some of these solutions and efforts with the scale and space doesn't take, a lot. It just needs to be consistent. You got to stay on it, and something will come. But that's what scale and scope means. It means a focus, a way to, direct our energy into a place. And this is also why cities were great for me to learn from, not just to study from, because it made material conditions more tangible. When we think about material conditions, it's not just hunger, it's how hunger applies itself in the city. Hunger in Mumbai is different than hunger in Little Rock, and it's different than hunger in Paris, but it's still hunger, and we can sort of see how it plays out, and how we can respond to it in each of those sort of spaces, and so forth. Whereas without the city, we can say material conditions, but we keep saying material conditions, and we don't really maybe speak.
We actually end up abstracting material conditions, which happens often, right? Like, we throw the word around,
Yeah.
like,
right, and just like we abstract mutual aid, and so then mutual aid becomes no longer the actual mutual aid, and it just becomes good care packages being sent or given or handed to individuals here and there. Yeah.
It just kind of I mean, anything could be abstracted, even if you're using the most materialist words, so that, because you're still just using words. So
yeah, and so that's why that's why I responded with, like, I don't know, I don't know if am I saying it's not mutual aid, or is it something else, or is it mutual, because since we don't think about scale and scope, we've done all types of things to the concept of mutual aid. And fundamentally what ends up happening is that we end up having ourselves in the business of dealing with the issue so large for the rest of our life, and we don't make a dent on it in the spaces that we inhabit, because we're just doing it without thinking about the space. So it's just good work that's just happening.
It almost has this I don't know, I call it hot potato activism. Like, it's almost like this, I'm gonna just do it, I'm gonna put it in the world, and somebody's gonna like catch it,
Right.
And like I'm waiting. It's got a very like it's almost biblical. Like the one will one day find my work and take us to the kingdom or something. Like it's very weird. So it's like if you do it, if they build it, they will. If you build it, they will come kind of approach, but not in any like, okay, how do we build it? We're just gonna like build it,
Right.
and one day somebody's gonna catch it, and it's just gonna happen. But we don't create an ecosystem that reinforces like you said, a scale. So what you got is a lot of people just doing stuff like, well, one day my podcast is gonna reach the masses, or one day our channel is gonna be big. None of that stuff. That stuff is it's very hopeful, and it never makes it. Also puts you in a position where you don't have to deal with now, like what is gonna happen now. Because I'm always like, well, one day this thing's gonna come. It's just I think that's an approach that not thinking spatially, I think can kind of impact you with, because what is the scale? If I know this block, I got a very specific amount of people in my mind. If I know it's this people that live on this block or live in this apartment complex or live in this neighborhood. But if it's just, this abstract idea of the Black community, you know, you know what I mean? Like it just doesn't, at some point, well, it just kind of like, I mean, I get everything can't be, on an atomic molecular level. Like I get that. Sometimes you need to speak broadly. Like we're not saying everything should be down to the block, but something has to be,
Right. Well, especially if you're trying to
Yeah.
grow the thing, right? So if we
Yeah.
are trying to have a Black community to build up, you got to build up to that. Like otherwise it just becomes this sort of elusive, mysterious thing, right? But if you don't actually build the spatial cohesion to have a community, because a community is not a neighborhood, then there isn't anything. And so I think it's related to also a lack of understanding around organizing. And organizing, you have to have a base. And typically that base is not just those people who are tied to the issue, they also are tied to the issue in a particular space, whether it's around housing or school and so forth. And so if you're a good organizer, you have a base of people who you can call on if you need to do an action. And an action could be a picket line, an occupation of a building, going to DC to do a march. If you're organizing, you have no base, then you're not an organizer yet, right? Like, because there's no population of people that have been so responsive to the work that you're doing, and you've impacted their lives so positively that they will respond to your call and request to continue that work in some other sort of public action, right?
Right.
But people throw away that notion of a base, and so they then take activism and make it synonymous to community organizing. You have to have no base with activism. You just have to respond to an issue. And so then when all of a sudden you need people to come out, you have nobody to come out, because the only way that you're trying to get people to come out is doing some Facebook page, some, tweet and so on. That means you have no, you're just throwing it out in the wind. Hey, if you care about this issue, come out. But if you have a base, you at least have a basic number of people who no doubts about it are going to come out for that. And not because of some personal favor, again, not because of cult of personality, but because you have connected them to maybe the larger issue that their issue is connected to.
Yeah. And I don't think and I think a lot of bad training leads us to think we're organizing when we're not. But that's a whole nother episode.
Right.
But yeah, another 3 hours. We did it again. great editing time.
I was worried.
Yeah, but so yeah, I don't know how much of this will make it wherever somewhere all of this will be played, whether that's on Patreon or somewhere all of this will be heard, other than a few comments here and there. But thanks again. Again, this is all a birth of chapter 3. This entire conversation, chapter 3, geographies of threat.
Yeah, and I, I there was a point that I wanted to mention was that, the city on the hill, that was something that, even though again we co-wrote the book, how we co-wrote the book is a whole nother discussion. But part of it was that you gave me with a charge to sort of lead drafting something on how cities can play out laundering. And even though what we're talking about is the spirit of that chapter, how it's talked about in the chapter is completely different because we go into specific mayors and so forth. But no, I appreciate that push, because I hadn't thought about making that connection or making it more explicit and as a whole chapter, maybe as a paragraph, as a point to mention, keep mentioning it in paragraphs here and there throughout the book, but really sort of spending a whole chapter on it got me to really think about how capital projects and mega events really are the secret sauce of laundering, right? You have a good capital project, a good mega event, you can erase all types of wrongdoing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's probably I would say, you said the secret sauce, I would say it's the most efficient.
Yeah.
Because anything that we're more likely to notice it starts on a municipal level, even if it's a federal law, even if it's done by some big multinational corporation or something, to really like bring it into light. You still needed to have the internet on your phone. You still needed to have electricity. You still needed to be able to charge it. All the infrastructure that's in place for you to receive propaganda. Because I'm saying that because that's what people often are drawn to with this book, and that's fine. But all that infrastructure is laid out for you, So whenever you see something, and even when we point out stuff that they're doing, like, oh, they're George Floyd this, or they're using George Floyd or Breonna for that, it's usually done at a location in a city, or if they're selling a product, you can buy it at Walmart down the street. Like you're always going to come back to that. So, like there's no version of this is never really a virtual thing. It's always the foundations are all there. So that's why I wanted that chapter, because I just didn't want there to be, I tend to criticize things with being abstract. So I obviously didn't want to, I don't think laundering is abstract at all, but I just know for me, I think it's our job to get down to the pipes as much as we can,
right?
Like we always got to get to the pipes, in my opinion. So yeah, I think that really helps out with that. But anyway, good talk. We'll sign off here. So we'll be back. I know I told y'all last time that we were coming back with the X-Men Magneto, but there's just been too much going on, and that actually takes way more research than y'all think it does, to read comic books, to watch comic movies, to watch comic cartoons, and then go listen to Malcolm X speeches and Martin Luther King speeches, and read Martin Luther King's books and read other books on King, and then that's actually a lot of work. I didn't even realize it was taking up that much. I was going to be doing that much work, so we'll be doing that next month, hopefully, since half of that work's already done. So see y'all next month. Peace out. Peace.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them